let's begin with that top story. So the Kenyan government yesterday recalled its ambassador in Mogadishu and ordered the Somali ambassador to leave the country in protest of Kenya's alleged auctioning of the oil and gas blocks located within disputed territorial waters of the Indian Ocean. Now, this threatens to ignite a fierce face-off between the two neighbors who are still defending their stake on the disputed waters at the International Court of Justice. But just what is the issue and what are the likely implications of the standoff? Our political affairs reporter Murimi Mwangi interrogates.
Strongly worded letter from Kenyan Foreign Affairs Principal Secretary Macharia Kamau ordering Mogadishu-based Kenyan ambassador to Somalia back home, while at the same time expelling the Nairobi-based Somali ambassador to Kenya, only fell short of directly declaring Somalia an enemy state. And it has all to do with a 62,000 square mile triangle of territorial waters in the Indian Ocean, believed to contain huge gas and oil deposits, and which for 5 years have been the subject of a bitter Kenya-Somalia dispute, still before the Hague-based International Court of Justice. In Nairobi's latest protest, Kenya claims that Somalia on the 7th of February this year auctioned gas and oil blocks said to be within the disputed waters, a move the Kenyan Foreign Affairs Ministry has termed as outrageous and provocative act of aggression, which will be met with unanimous and resounding rejection by all Kenyans. A statement international relations expert Professor Macharia Munene argues only came short of declaring war on Somalia.
You have an insult, because that's what it is. Somalia purporting to give leases and exploration rights to some companies in London on Kenyan waters.
But what really is the maritime dispute? In response to a 2014 petition filed by Somalia before the International Court of Justice, the Kenyan government, through former Attorney General Professor Githu Muigai, argued that Kenya had exercised an uncontested jurisdiction on the said sea area, since Kenya first proclaimed her exclusive economic zone in 1979. In Kenya's argument, the maritime borderline runs in a horizontal straight line from the point of the Kenya-Somali border intersection, giving Kenya 100,000 square kilometers of highly lucrative territory, including the disputed triangle. But Somalia argues Kenya is claiming more than her fair share, insisting that the borderline ought to run southeastwards, giving almost the same size of territory to Somalia. An argument Kenya claims would also affect her border with Tanzania. This case is still pending before court after Kenya lost in her preliminary attempt to stop the petition. But could the Somali February 7th London auction and Kenya's swift retaliation have more than meets the eye?
Some of the companies that may be involved are very well connected with the powerful people in European capitals, politically powerful people. Not just financially, of course they're financially powerful, but also politically powerful people. So it looks as if it's an indirect aggression on Kenya.
I think this matter should be tackled carefully, urgently, and the international community should not take it for granted, because we do not want any escalation of conflict in this region.
The Kenya-Somalia boundaries disputes is, however, not a new phenomenon. Only months after Kenya's independence in 1963, Mogadishu had backed a secession attempt by the Kenyan Northern Frontier District, comprising present-day Wajir, Mandera, Marsabit, Garissa, and Isiolo counties, which wanted to join up with the larger Somalia, a dispute which culminated in the Shifta War of the 60s, ending in 1967. But with the Kenyan troops already actively involved in the stabilization efforts of the war-torn Somalia under the AMISOM umbrella, pundits argue this latest standoff is no doubt poised to complicate the Nairobi-Mogadishu diplomatic relations, even as the Hague-based court prepares to resume hearing the dispute. Murimi Mwangi, KTN News.
So now, political affairs reporter Murimi Mwangi has been keeping tabs with this story ever since it started. And let's talk to our reporter Murimi Mwangi from a city center studio. Murimi, good morning. This is not a good, dispute between the two countries, especially when it comes to security within the regional borders.
Well, good morning, Brenda. Well, there was a quick response yesterday from the Somali government denying any auctioning of the oil and gas resources within the disputed section of the maritime border. And of course, they also did defend the maps that they used in the London auction that happened on the 7th of February this year. But if you look at the timelines from the date of that auction, the 7th, come to the 16th, which is on Saturday, when that strongly worded letter came from the Kenyan Foreign Affairs Ministry, it's just a span of 9 days, and that tells you that the Kenyan government has seemingly been on the radar of their Somali counterparts with regards to this dispute that has been ongoing for close to 5 years now. Remember, it all started in 2014 when Somalia petitioned the Hague-based International Court of Justice to arbitrate in that dispute, claiming that Kenya was misinterpreting what is the maritime borderline between the two countries. And the bone of contention is which direction that borderline should follow. In Kenya's arguments, the default 200 nautical miles allowance into the ocean ought to run parallel to the latitude from the point of intersection of the two countries' borders, but in Somalia's argument that ought to run in a southeastern direction from the point of intersection, but just following the direction of the borderline from the Somali perspective. But the Kenyan government's argument is, if that were to happen, then that default 200 nautical miles radius would also affect the Kenyan maritime borderline with Tanzania, and therefore that is a case which is actively before the Hague-based International Court of Justice. What happened initially was that the Kenyan government, through a legal delegation led by former Attorney General Professor Githu Muigai, sought to stop that petition by way of a preliminary objection, arguing that the matters that Somalia had petitioned the court to arbitrate were canvassed in a memorandum of understanding between the two governments, and that particular MOU in Kenya's argument had set out mechanisms for arbitration of any emergent disputes without the necessity of having to go before court. But Kenya lost in that argument, and therefore the court directed in 2017, sometime in February, that that case was to proceed to full hearing. And therefore, in the wake of this new diplomatic row, perhaps it creates urgency for the court to arbitrate that particular dispute and bring closure to this dispute, because the maritime section in dispute is perceived to be rich in oil and gas resources, perhaps the reason why the two countries are jostling for that section, but not without the diplomatic tiff that now has escalated the tensions between Somalia and Kenya. Brenda.
Murimi, talking about this case having kicked off in 2014, it looks like it's, let me say, 6 or 5 years so, but correct me if I'm wrong. Why has the case taken that long?
Well, it all depends on the timelines of court. Remember, initially when the petition was filed, Kenya took her time and filed what is called a preliminary objection. It's usually a strategic mechanism for most constitutional court disputes to just stall the petition from the word go, and perhaps if you get the nod of court, then you suspend the entire petition in entirety and retain the status quo. But in this case, Kenya's argument that the issues that Somalia had petitioned before court had been addressed in the MOU did not seem to convince the judges, because by a majority of 13 to 3 judges, they resolved that this matter ought to proceed to full hearing, and that ruling was in 2017. Remember, in such cases of diplomatic nature touching on such weighty matters, a lot comes into play, you would argue, because there's also the issue of domestic as well as regional politics. Remember, from February 2nd, I think, because that's when the ruling on the case or on the application by Kenya for the preliminary objection was made. If you look at that, it's only a few months before Kenya went into its 2017 general election. But of course, given the urgency that now emanates from this new diplomatic row, perhaps the case will have to be expedited to give closure to this dispute that now puts these two neighbors in not very good terms, Brenda.
And talking about the diplomatic row, Murimi, we've seen Kenya recall back its ambassador to Somalia and ordering the Somalian ambassador to Kenya to go back home until this issue is sorted. So for how long is this going to happen? Are we likely to see Kenya sending back its diplomat to Somalia and probably Somalia sending back his diplomat to Kenya?
Well, the Somali government in their statement yesterday claims that no consultations were made before PS Macharia Kamau issued that statement recalling the Kenyan ambassador and seemingly expelling the Somali counterpart back to Mogadishu. But as I said, if you look at the timelines from the date when the auction is said to have happened in London, which was the 7th of February, and the 16th, when that decision was arrived at by the Kenyan Foreign Affairs Ministry, it's only a span of 9 days. And in a decision of this magnitude, of course, you can't, of course, miss out what happens to be the backroom attempts to resolve the standoff before such a decision is made. But of course, given the weighty nature of this matter and this being subject to arbitration before the International Court of Justice, we expect more deliberations to follow from the foreign affairs ministries of the two countries before a decision is ultimately made. But in the statement, Somalia did insist that it's also waiting for the resolution of the dispute before court and would follow whatever decision which is arrived at, which will ultimately give closure to this matter, giving the territory in question to either Kenya or Somalia. Brenda.
Moremi, you've been following up this story very keenly, and one question is probably what's running in my mind and in the minds of so many other Kenyans and Somalis is why would Somalia be so interested in auctioning the oil and gas blocks, which is located, of course, within this disputed territorial waters?
Well, Somalia has denied auctioning the oil and gas in that section, but what perhaps caught the attention of Kenyans or the Kenyan government was the maps that the Somali Republic had used in the said auction, and those maps reportedly seemed to show that section which is in dispute among those that were displayed in the auction as potential markets or potential oil fields for exploration by whoever would partake of that auction. But Somalia has denied that the oil and gas resources in the specific section were part of that auction. But oil and gas, of course, is a key source of income to most states, and having control on that section is what is at the center of this dispute between Kenya and Somalia. But besides that, why this perhaps might have alarmed the Kenyan government is that it's not the very first time that Somalia and Kenya are wrangling over affairs of a boundary. Remember, in the early years of independence after 1963, when Mzee Jomo Kenyatta was still a prime minister, they were laying claim to what used to be the northern frontier district, which wanted to be part of Somalia. Diplomacy failed in that dispute, and that culminated in the physical confrontations that came with the shifter war that lasted up to 1967. So perhaps to forestall a likely plunge into a similar predicament, this could explain why Kenya has taken a firm stand now, issuing a strongly worded statement and seeing the presentation of these contentious sections of the maritime section among those that were for auction in London as a direct provocation on the sovereignty of Kenya, given that it's also laying claim to that section whose ownership is yet to be resolved by the International Court of Justice. Brenda.
Right, thank you so much, Murimi Mwangi, for that report. Of course, I know you still continue to keep